And one of the reasons why I think this is important for myself and perhaps for some of your listeners is I wouldn't want people to get caught in the dark. I mean, this is one of those questions that some folks will kind of I gotcha on this one, your Christianity, your beliefs, your evangelicalism, and then they'll kind of do a gotcha. Hey, did you know that there's this background? And so one of the reasons why I think it would be important for us to know about this is so that you're not caught in the dark, that you're prepared to know this history, know some of the ideas with it, because the critics already know about it.
And as we talk about the fact that this nation, as we come to the 250th anniversary since the Declaration of Independence, has some very good things to recommend, but there are also some very dark chapters in American history, and one of those is slavery. And so we're going to spend some time talking about that. We want to focus on this new book, which has the title Ownership, The Evangelical Legacy of Slavery in Edwards, Wesley, and Whitefield. And it is written by Dr. Sean McGever. He has his Ph.D. from the University of Aberdeen. As a matter of fact, his book that came out in 2020, Born Again, The Evangelical Theology Conversion of John Wesley and George Whitefield, is one that I really would commend to you. We might even have him back sometime to talk about that came out a couple of years ago, Evangelism for the Care of Souls. Sometimes we get so involved when we are actually involved in evangelism about technique that we don't realize we're engaged in soul care. Anyway, he is an individual who also serves as the area director for Young Life in Phoenix, Arizona, and is one of the adjunct faculty at Grand Canyon University, where one of my colleagues actually teaches there as well. So, Dr. McGever, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yeah, thank you for having me on, Kerby. Appreciate it.
Let's, if we can, get right into it, because early on people might say, slavery, what does that have to do with me? And, of course, you were speaking at Old South Presbyterian Church there in Massachusetts. And having lived in the Northeast, I'm very well aware of that. Also lived on the West Coast and a number of other places. But when we've traveled up there and even been to some places where Jonathan Edward preached and in places where George Whitefield was speaking up and down the Atlantic coast, I'm well aware of some of the history. But you've had some people, and probably even some of your students, say, why should I care about slavery? That happened in the 18th century, and we Christians were on the right side. Well, not so fast, right?
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. I mean, why bring up kind of a difficult topic? No one's going to say this is an easy topic to talk about. It's a painful one, so let's just not talk about it. I'll tell you a little bit about my story, why I thought this would be worth for my own investigation, and why I know that readers have found it helpful, which is that, my story is I didn't grow up in the church or anything like that. And when I was a teenager, a youth ministry, Young Life, reached out to me, and by God's grace, my life was changed, and that's wonderful. As I was so excited about the gospel that I received about being born again, about evangelism, about evangelicalism, of which I'm still very much a part of, very active in with Young Life, what we do at Grand Canyon, etc. I was really interested in kind of the type of gospel that I received. Where did this come from? This kind of in the history of the church, and that led me to, go to seminary and do an MDiv, and go to St. Andrews and do a Master of Letters, do my PhD on these great early evangelicals, John Wesley, George Whitefield, and Jonathan Edwards eventually. And it's like, okay, what is this gospel that I received? And as I looked into it more, and like you mentioned about my earlier book about being born again and how that concept emerged in the history of the church and for evangelicals, I realized that there was this history, with slavery. And I thought, wow, this is really complicated. And after I got through kind of my theological work, systematic theology, historical theology, I wanted to backtrack and look into this historical work. And one of the reasons why I think this is important for myself and perhaps for some of your listeners is I wouldn't want people to get caught in the dark. I mean, this is one of those questions that some folks will kind of I gotcha on this one, your Christianity, your beliefs, your evangelicalism, and then they'll kind of do a gotcha. Hey, did you know that there's this background? And so one of the reasons why I think it would be important for us to know about this is so that you're not caught in the dark, that you're prepared to know this history, know some of the ideas with it, because the critics already know about it. This is a common response and criticism of Christianity and different kind of versions of Christianity. So why would we want to care about it? We want to be able to to have an answer for these questions, and they're legitimate questions. They're
Yes.
not they're very legitimate ones. So we need to be able to have an answer. I think it is also good to have some idea about modern slavery, trafficking, forced labor, prison labor, to be able to be prepared for some Christian answers and how is it that Christians could engage with that, because there are versions of this that continue. There's also another really interesting thing, which would be the era that we're talking about, and it sounds like you guys are deeply invested in understanding kind of early American history and the roots of that and the religious beliefs and that. But my book kind of takes a snapshot, if you will, roughly like in the year 1700, takes a theological historical snapshot of Christians' attitudes towards slavery, 1700, and then fast forwards 100 years later, in 1800, and says, okay, what were attitudes and approaches to the topic of slavery then? And what we'll find, and what I display in my book, is this radical change that happened in the history of Christianity, where there was a shifting of understanding of what the Bible teaches about the ways Christians should engage this topic. And so it's an extremely dynamic period about the ways that people reassess their evaluation of how they read the Bible, the way that culture, the idea of independence, monarchy, freedom, liberty, all of these important topics that I know that we all care a lot about. This is a century of change when it comes to Christian attitudes about this. And this topic, this difficult topic of slavery, is one that we can now, with the benefit of a couple hundred years of perspective, look at and learn from. So yeah, there's a couple useful reasons why we should dust off this incredibly difficult topic.
Well, you've come to the right place, because one of the things we like to talk about is always be prepared to make a defense for the hope that is in you. So that's apologetics. We also like to talk about history. And I might just mention, some of the learning that we've done has come at the hands of an individual that used to be at Baylor, now at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. That's Dr. Thomas Kidd, who is one of many individuals, along with George Marsden and Mark Knoll and a number of others, that have actually endorsed your book. So again, if people are wanting to know more, Ownership, the Evangelical Legacy of Slavery in Edwards, Wesley, and Whitefield. And just as we come to a break, let me just mention that maybe the wake-up call for some, as you talk about early on, was 5 years ago at the University of Pennsylvania, and I've been there, decided to remove a statue of George Whitefield. And George Whitefield, we've talked about, was kind of the Billy Graham of the 18th century, if you will, and he was removed because people found out that he was a slave owner. And then it's certainly been the case that oftentimes the argument has always been, if they were engaged in slavery, we shouldn't even pay attention to them, and we started tearing down all sorts of statues. And just before we get into them being the men of their times, I'm going to be in Savannah, Georgia next week, and of course we have listeners there and all over Georgia, as well as all over the country. And one of the things you took the time to do was go to the African American Culture Center in Savannah. And what you found was kind of interesting, because in some respects, what you found is white folks, as you said, were really embarrassed about a conversation about slavery, and black folks were worn out by it. And yet here we are doing a program on that, and you've written a book on it. But in some respects, there's a need to begin to clarify and to be honest about our history. And that's why I appreciate your book so much.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the time that I spent there in Savannah was eye-opening. The primary reason I went there was because one of the people that we might discuss in my books about, George Whitefield, started an orphanage there, and it still has a legacy that's going on there. So it was, they're kind to host me, and I spent time with them. But then, yeah, I was there at the Beach Institute in Savannah and talked with the director at length, and had other conversations that, I understand. People didn't want to talk about it. That didn't surprise me. But I think the point of history is what we can learn from it, and that we can be prepared, especially those of us that are passionate about evangelism, the gospel. We need to be able to be prepared, like we mentioned in the last segment, to have a hope for which we have.
Well, let's, if we can, talk about men of their times. And of course, you use one quote from Dr. Henry Louis Gates at Harvard, But whether it's him or a variety of others, whether we're talking about George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, whether we're talking about Abraham Lincoln, whether we're talking about George Whitefield, whether we're talking about Jonathan Edwards, there is a sense in which, and you do a very good job early on in the book, helping us understand that slavery was there for a long time. People were born into a belief that slavery was pretty much routine. And we sometimes today in our 21st century world say, how is it that Christians could miss that this idea of buying and selling individuals was immoral and unjustified and maybe an unbiblical, and that I think helps us understand some of the influences that are the first part of your book.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, no one can control the society, the time, place, location that you're born into. That's nothing that we need to make an excuse for or try to explain away. It just is what it is. You have no control over that. And in fact, to go further, from a Christian's perspective, we also should expect, because of original sin and the prevalence of sin in the world, that there's going to be things wrong with our culture. There's going to be things that need to be corrected about beliefs and attitudes. So no one's immune from this. And also, I mean, while we are, doctrine of original sin is important, we have no control over if I was born in 1700s America, or I was born today, or I was born in the biblical era, or what have you. And so more of it is recognizing the situation that you're born into. And really, that's kind of a parallel conversation of almost like an age of accountability. There becomes a crossover point where you have no control over where you're at and what you're born into once you start to recognize for yourself the things that you are now making active choices about, the activities, ideologies that you are perpetuating, forwarding, affirming as your own responsibility. And so once our eyes are open to that, it's definitely a different situation.
Well, again, I think it's helpful that early on in the book you explain how some Christians made their peace with it, that slavery was ordained by God, or slavery is a result of sin, or acquiring slaves maybe should be done within limits. They would then quote a verse out of context that slaves must obey their masters and those kinds of things. So there was a fair amount of teaching. Let's give credit where credit is due. There were quite a number of Christians that were abolitionists and wanted to end the slave trade and wanted to ban slavery. But how is it that some individuals who call themselves Christians, read the Bible, came to a conclusion that slavery is just something that we should take for granted? Can you help us out with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the sad truth of the matter is that prior to about the year 1700, Christians who were in power affirmed the institution of slavery. When they read the Bible, they saw it as a manual about how to regulate the institution of slavery rather than questioning the institution itself. And that's a really important point of distinction that my book sets forth in the very beginning, and that often is overlooked: the difference between the institution of slavery and the management of slavery. And up until about the year 1700, most Christians in power, almost without any exceptions, they saw the Bible about how to manage the institution of slavery in a biblical way, and hopefully in a loving, et cetera, kind of way, but they saw it as a management manual rather than questioning the institution itself. And that's the thing about the 18th century that is really important, which is that people started to question if even the Bible taught that the institution itself was taught, and that we should affirm that. So that was a major turning point. There's really very few, if any, instances in church history where people questioned the institution until about the year 1700. And this is around the world, not just America, around the world. And I cataloged that in that chapter, in the third chapter, about attitudes towards slavery by Christians in the year 1700. Those are pretty, that was essentially what they were.
It was part of the culture. I don't quote Bill Maher every day here on Point of View, but a while back he was saying something about slavery, and he said, look, don't sit here and argue that you would never have been a slaveholder. You would never have allowed slavery to exist. If you'd lived in that time, you might have yourself. And a little bit later, when we talk about this, I'm going to talk about things that we certainly turn a blind eye to today in the 21st century. But talk for just a couple minutes about that chapter on participation, because, yes, we had slavery that existed since really, we read about that even in the Old Testament, for example. But how did these people participate? And it turns out that whether you look at John Wesley or Jonathan Edwards or George Whitefield, they were. Now, to be fair, John Wesley more just had a, as you call it, 37-year silence about this. But help us out with those three individuals, because that helps us understand the issue that you really have as kind of the center part of your book.
Yeah. One of the really fascinating things about the history of these three individuals is that John Wesley, who's the founder of Methodism, and some people recognize his name, and Jonathan Edwards, which some other listeners will know, John Piper and others had brought him a lot of attention. John Wesley and Jonathan Edwards were born in the same year, about 100 days apart.
Yes.
But they were born in two places, across the Atlantic. And I would imagine that if their lives had been switched and they had been born, maybe in each other's shoes, if you will, they would have like had the same exact beliefs just because of their context. And the important part would be that Jonathan Edwards was born into a strong Christian house that also enslaved Africans. So from the earliest memories that Jonathan Edwards had, his family had enslaved people, and he was used to that. And Jonathan Edwards, from the beginning of his memories until the day he died, participated in that. On the other side of the Atlantic, born in the exact same year, a Christian with just as much of a commitment to the gospel, etc., John Wesley, did not grow up in a context where enslaving people in your house, etc., was a norm. And so he did not participate in that. He encountered that in his missionary work when he went to Georgia and he went to Savannah, and then up into South Carolina as well briefly. But then it was very familiar. It was excited to actually evangelize those that are enslaved. But went back to England, knew firsthand about the atrocities and the difficulties of slavery, but didn't really do anything about it for about 37 years. And we could talk about that later era. But their participation was largely based on their context. Jonathan Edwards being in colonial America, John Wesley being in England, what they grew up with and what they saw, and then what they continued with. George Whitefield is the really interesting one because he goes back 13 times transatlantic travels.
Right.
And he basically has a foot in both countries.
Yes,
and so he's the dynamic figure where he kind of has John Wesley's origins, where this is not a norm. But then he spends just so much time in America that he becomes an enslaver, not unlike Jonathan Edwards. So he is the transitory kind of person that we can really take a close look at his life about how he interacts with both cultures.
Hey there, Megan Kitchen here, creator of the Highlights podcast. Sorry to interrupt, but I would like to ask a small favor if I could. If you appreciate anything about today's episode or it enhances your own point of view, would you please let us know? You can do it easily by sending an email to podcastcomments@pointofview.net. When you email us your feedback, it helps me to create more episodes based on topics that help you and your friends discern a biblical perspective on the world. So, penny for your thoughts? Again, that email is podcastcomments@pointofview.net. Now, back to the episode.
One of the things you say early on in the book, but it's relevant to what you just said a few minutes ago before we took the break, the great-grandparents of Wesley, Whitefield, and Edwards did not enslave people. The primary question that determined whether their grandchildren and great-grandchildren would enslave people is this: which side of the Atlantic did they live on? Our historical and geographical locateness profoundly influences our decision-making, including our Christian decision-making. And so in some respects, people say, well, how could they accept that? Well, it was more acceptable in America than it was in England. Of course, George Whitefield was in both of those. But one very quick mention I think is worthwhile, and that is action against slavery. And one of those unlikely voices, you say, are the Quakers. And so even at the time, you had not just the Quakers, but then later on, of course, Wesley himself speaking out against slavery. So let's give credit where credit is due. We ended up having an abolition movement, didn't we?
Absolutely. Yeah. And it starts, like you just introduced, in an unlikely place. The Quakers were founded by a guy named George Fox around 1650. He had a vision, and it led to a focus on the inner light that is inside of every person. It kind of might be similar to how Christians might imagine that the Holy Spirit might speak to every person, something kind of parallel to that. And as the Quakers developed and grew, they really prioritized kind of the leading of this inner light, or perhaps of the Holy Spirit. And with that, in kind of their original ethos, kind of their foundational view on the way that they believed that God interacted with people, that really stabilized and equalized all people. God could speak to men, God could speak to women, God could speak to masters, God could speak to slaves, etc. And so because of that, they had a view for a radical equality of all people that was unusual in their era. And so that developed, started in 1650, and about 100 years into that, 1750, 1760, as they're seeing, especially in America, they're coming because they're persecuted for their beliefs. In England, they, like others, flee England and head over to the colonies, and are starting to thrive in Pennsylvania, William Penn, that area and others.
Yes.
They take, and then they're also saying, wow, this slavery, the treatment of Black people, the treatment of lessers in society, and they start speaking up about it. So they become extremely active once they, kind of get the roots there in 1750, 1760, and there's this key figure among the Quakers named Anthony Benezet, and he starts documenting some of the atrocities that are happening. And his real kind of priority, or where this is coming from, is because he believes in the radical equality of all people. And he brings this out, and it's being documented. People are shocked. And so in 1772, Wesley ends up reading the most prominent document that comes out, and he is absolutely shocked by what he's reading. And he remembers back to decades earlier when he was in South Carolina, and he had seen some of this himself, and he felt like he couldn't just stay silent anymore.
And so again, as you even point out, as he concluded his eulogy for George Whitefield and stepped down from that chapel, he's thinking about the fact that Whitefield, of course, had led so many people to the Lord, had such a great influence, and even had an orphanage, but the orphanage operated on the backs of slave labor. So now he sort of has, as you say, his own eulogy because of all those, well, at least 2 or 3 decades worth of silence, now begins to speak out.
Yeah, that's right. So this is, like I said, it's just a dynamic time. I mean, the 1770s, obviously we had 1776, the American, but also for this, Wesley speaks at his good friend George Whitefield's, his funeral. Whitefield had requested that he would, and it's not the right place at a eulogy or funeral to maybe bring up the deficiencies of a person. But Wesley was very familiar with what was happening at Whitefield's orphanage, which was funded by slavery, and Whitefield actually helped advocate for Georgia to flip from the only colony that in which slavery was illegal. Whitefield had helped push Parliament to be able to flip it so that slavery was legal. So Whitefield was deeply entrenched in a pro-slavery movement and participation in that. So Wesley knew about that, but then, he comes into contact with this Quaker writing, and I feel like something had been bubbling up in him.
Probably.
And in kind of the ethos of that era, where I think there's a better way forward. And he, in 1772, reads the works of these Quakers, who were an unusual group. They were kind of not the most orthodox group. They didn't prioritize the Trinity and how they had their services and such. Christians were skeptical about kind of whether or not these folks were Christian. Wesley had his questions too, but he still listened to them. And 1772 reads them. And in 1774, Wesley writes his kind of pivotal document, Thoughts Upon Slavery, which is where he says, I need to speak up. I need to say this is wrong.
Well, and again, that gets us back to one of the things that you have later in your book, and that is the legacy. The legacy of Jonathan Edwards was, of course, that he disapproved of the slave trade, but he still enslaved individuals, Africans, and promoted slavery as an institution. With George Whitefield, we've already sort of buried him in one sense, and did not leave a family behind nor did he really leave a movement behind. But with the John Wesley, we have everything, because now he is talking and speaking to this issue. He's writing to William Wilberforce. He's writing about this. As a matter of fact, you never want to trace too far back your family lineage, but my father did one time and find out that a good number of my ancestors were Methodist circuit riders and abolitionists, which was good to hear,
well, that's
because because of Methodism. And now that, of course, gets us into the second great revival, great awakening, which we won't get into today. But you can see some of the legacy that continued on because of a decision made by John Wesley, can't you?
Yes, yeah. It ends up being a bit of a mixed reception, but yeah, there's absolute good. Famously, the last letter that Whitefield writes right before he dies is to William Wilberforce, saying, "Keep up the fight. Do not give up."
Right.
So, I mean, really, that's Wesley's parting words in his life, and we're so thankful for William Wilberforce and everything that he did. So, Wesley, in the last 8 years of his life, is very vocal and sets a great trend. What happens is the Methodist movement is growing massively in America. In the 1800s, it becomes the largest denomination in America. So it's
right.
The loudest voice in America during that era. And the challenge is, just like the Civil War and stuff, people are divided for a variety of reasons on where they fall on this. And so the legacy of Methodism has good and bad parts to it. Where you could have like yourself, have a legacy that goes back to Methodist abolitionism. That's wonderful. Or it could be on the other side where maybe enslavers. So, like for instance, Frederick Douglass, who a lot of people have heard of. His enslaver was not a Christian.
Yeah.
Yes, and his enslaver goes to a Methodist revival, becomes a Christian. And Frederick Douglass says he became an even more despotic, cruel enslaver because he felt like his slavery and his treatment of the slave was of Frederick Douglass was now supported by the Bible, and so actually became a more cruel man. But then what's fascinating, a lot of people don't read to the end of Frederick Douglass's narrative. He strikes a big difference. You would think that someone like him would say, well, then, I'm just going to reject Christianity and all this. But instead, he doesn't. Frederick Douglass says, no, there is a vast difference between the Christianity of the slaveholder, of the master, and the Christianity of Christ. And I mean, that's just such a powerful witness to the gospel of Christ and to the message of Christ, as opposed to when we notice that there's obvious sin, there's personal gain, and we just need to be very aware of when we compromise the true gospel and grace of Christ and the equality of all people that he wants us to communicate to all people.
Yeah, in his appendix, you have this quote here where, again, Frederick Douglass says, "What I've said respecting and against religion, I mean strictly to apply to the slave-holding religion, for between Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference." And, of course, he praises the Black Methodist churches and a number of other things that are part of that. Dr. Sean McGever with us, and you start this section by talking about the fact that, well, you and your fiance were engaged, and now it's time to tell the whole story, the good and the bad. And, of course, you can't just discard the parts you dislike and keep the parts you enjoy, because, that's marriage. When we get into our heroes, when we get into the issue of the slave history in America, it's not just the good and the bad, it's the good and the bad and the ugly. And it seems to me, and I'll see if you agree or not, but I'm going to step out on a limb and say that some of the criticism that I've seen about many of these people in the 18th century engages in what might be called chronological snobbery. C.S. Lewis talks about that.
Right.
Well, I'm in the 21st century. There's just no possible way that I would countenance slavery. Well, you're not a man of the times. You were not involved there. I'm not excusing it, but I am trying to understand. And there are people that sometimes will say, how can we even allow the statue of George Whitefield to exist? Yes, he did all sorts of good, and he created an orphanage and led all sorts of people to the Lord, but he also had slaves. And you see this with George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. You see this even with some of the statements that Abraham Lincoln has made. And I think that does engage in, I think, chronological snobbery. But what's your thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, the challenge is that we are expecting perfection from humans that aren't Jesus. Every person has failures, and so we should just own them. We should not expect anyone other than Christ to be perfect, and so we should always be in the position that God is gracious enough to do good and true things through any person, and that can reflect God. At the same time, those people, other than Christ, are always going to be people who carry with them and participate in sin. And so there should be a freedom that we don't expect too much from them, just like when I look in the mirror and I look at myself, as much as I want to be perfect, one of the bases of my faith is to confess my sins and to thank God that He knows and accepts me as I am. I don't claim to be a perfect person. I don't want anyone to remember me or to try to remember me as a perfect person. That's just not truthful. However, if God in His graciousness has been able to do good and true and beautiful things through me, all praise be to God. And so when we look back at these people in American history, Christian history, we need to have a similar posture that we might have for ourselves or someone else that we know really well, where we go, there's good and there's bad. And it's okay. And we can have a person that who enslaved someone and say, we 100% reject that. And a difference between the word and but is important there. And recognize that God used them in powerful ways. And that's not to their own credit. It was because the grace of God worked through them. And so that distinction of rather than a but instead of saying an and is so important, because that is the dichotomy that every human other than Christ lives in.
One of the other things I might mention is that if you are convinced that you would, in the 18th century, have fought against slavery, you would have been part of the abolition movement, and maybe some would, what goes on today that you should be involved in? And lots of times people say, well, we don't have slavery today. Well, you look around the world, there is slavery in some parts of the world, and they are certainly slave labor. Let me hold up this book for just a minute. Check Your Financial Privilege. Alex Gladstone reminds us that most of us are walking around with clothes, with shoes, maybe with cell phones that were actually manufactured through slave labor of some sort. And so if you are really convinced that you would be involved in trying to right the evils of slavery in the 18th century, how about getting involved today in some of those actions? And whether it's standing for life and preventing abortion, whether it's standing for justice in many of these third world countries, there's just a lot to do. And in some respects, your final chapter reminds us that if we really want to own the idea that these were flawed individuals that made mistakes, and really would hope that all of them would leave a legacy, as eventually John Wesley did, what can we do today to maybe right some of the wrongs that we see around us?
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, I coach high school basketball. I like Nike shoes. All the high school guys around, they like Nike. And as I was writing this book, I thought, I'm not so sure that these shoes that I love were produced in ethical ways that are consistent with what I do. There's choices that we make about, definitely like your checkbook. That's an excellent example. Are we, promoting and using the resources that God has given us to be able to try to promote things, whether it be the shoes or in our community? I don't, I guess I could choose different shoes, but there are plenty of things in my community that I can be active with my time, my possessions, my privilege, those sort of things. Like for myself, one of the places I have the most sphere of influence. So a question that I ask people when we talk about this is, what spheres of influence do you have? And obviously our checkbook, everyone has that. My influence, because I work for an evangelical ministry, is in evangelism. And so there is a temptation with evangelicals, and I've written a lot about evangelical conversion, and I'm an evangelist. I love evangelizing, very passionate about it. At the same time, I want to be very careful that I don't do so in a way that is a power trip, where as if I'm God holding over you your salvation. The offer of the gospel is a response that a person has between them and God, and it's their relationship with God. It could be very easy in my sphere of influence as an evangelist to try to manipulate conversations and things like that, where I could try to use power, sophisticated reasoning, etc. And while God might use some of those dynamics in his mercy, I need to be very mindful. Like, for instance, at my desk here, where I'm working and speaking right now, I have the receipt of George Whitfield's inventory of his belongings after he died, his belongings and the prices. And I have from the Georgia Archives the receipt that has things like how many cows he owned and how many shovels he owned. And sadly, and it's awful, the names of all of the people that when he died that he enslaved and their value. And the reason I have such a terrible document in front of me is to remind me as an evangelist to be very mindful about not dehumanizing any person that I'm in front of, and to try to use a power move as an evangelist, as a Christian, and instead to communicate with no strings attached the good, free offer of the gospel, and to leave the results to God. So I think it's just a question about our spheres of influence, our resources that we have, and where we can speak up for God being God and not us being God.
Let me just mention this before I let you go, that we do have a link to Young Life and the particular organization that you are involved with. We also, of course, have your Facebook link there as well, and people would want to contact you, maybe have you come and speak to this issue. And certainly, I certainly have just high regard for Young Life. We've had a number of other speakers with Young Life. It was influential in my own conversion as well, and it's just great that we could have you on the program today. And thank you for the time that you spent in first writing this book, and thank you for giving us an hour today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much, Kerby. I really appreciate it.
Again, the book is entitled Ownership: The Evangelical Legacy of Slavery in Edwards, Wesley, and Whitefield. It is one of the dark chapters in American history. We need to tell all of the story as well. And Jonathan Edwards, John Wesley, George Whitefield were the world's three most prominent evangelicals at that time. All three were deeply compromised when you come to the issue of slavery, and that's why we thought it would be worth talking about today. Don't forget that if you would like more information about what we're talking about, you can find it at the website pointofview.net. That's all we have for today. We look forward to seeing you next time right here on Point of View Highlights.
Thanks so much for listening to today's Point of View Highlights. I'm Liberty McCarter, host of the Know Why podcast, a weekly podcast for young adults who want to know why they believe what they believe. If you have young adults in your life who would like more meaningful conversations like this, send them over to knowwhypodcast.com. And we'll see you next time on Point of View Highlights.